Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for this month's edition of the Step Outside podcast. My name is Katie Donaldson. I'm here at the School of Natural Resources at the UT Institute of Agriculture. Joining me today is master's student Ellie Burken. As far as being a master's student, you're hoping to graduate this summer.
Yep, that's a game plan.
So very busy time for you right now.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. And your research has been on the northern bobwhite, and specifically its habitat selection.
Habitat selection, then also general population metrics, but more so on survival as well.
And how did you decide for that to be your focus for your research?
So I think I graduated from my undergrad in 2020, and I knew I wanted a year of technician work and things like that to figure out what exactly I wanted to do. But I knew I wanted a project that focused on something that was spatial or population related, just because that's what I find most interesting in terms of ecology and things like that. So from there, it worked out really well that I was working on the turkey project that's also through UT, and I met, one of my advisors there, and wooed him in that conversation into, looking at me as a candidate for this project. So it worked out really well through some connections that I got onto this project.
When did your project start?
So my project started in January of 2021, and so then they started the trapping and capture process for our birds, and I came onto the project in June, so I missed the first 5-6 months. So essentially for what we do, the base process of how we gathered a lot of our data is we did a lot of trapping across the WMA. We did that using funnel traps. They're essentially very similar to a dove trap, so a small wire cage that a bird can walk into because there'll be some seed or bait in the middle, but they can't easily come back out due to a funnel. And so we spent a lot of time capturing bobwhites and then, obviously collaring them with a radio collar. So ours were a small necklace format where the radio transmitter sat here and the antenna went down the back, and then spent a lot of our time tracking birds after that. So during the winter we would do it roughly 3 times a week, but during the summer we would increase that a little bit more just so we could start to key in on nesting behavior if that happened, to really tell whether they were sitting in the same exact spot day after day. So we trapped from the months of October all the way through April. And we did it over that long of a period because most of the time we could reach our sample size that we were going for, but bobwhites don't live very long, so, especially wild bobwhites. So we were continuously replenishing our sample size.
You said you're focusing on 3 focal areas. Which 3 focal areas are you focusing on in Tennessee? I know they're wildlife management areas.
Yep. So for Tennessee, it has the 4 different regions for their Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency, and so on each of those areas, they had defined a quail focal area, and so I'm looking at region 1, 3, and 4. And specifically, I'm looking at Wolf River Wildlife Management Area, Bridgestone Firestone Wildlife Management Area, and then Kiker Bottoms Wildlife Management Area. So Kiker Bottoms is a little bit of an odd one. It's technically a quail demonstration area, but it's essentially the same thing as a focal area. It just means it's a little bit smaller in terms of acreage.
You're also looking at survival during different seasons. Have you seen it vary greatly from season to season?
Yes, and that's still being refined, so I don't have exact numbers for you yet. But in terms of survival generally, in comparison to other studies in other areas, Texas and Florida and Georgia, those are all areas that have really established quail research and robust populations there. Our survival estimates are actually pretty comparable. We're not top of the line, but we're pretty, middle of the range in terms of a nationwide coverage of survival rates. So for us, though, I think we thought that winter might be the limiting season in terms of survival, just harsher weather, less food available on the ground, things like that. But I think our summer survival rates are actually a little bit lower than we expected. So that's what we'll go in and hopefully focus on and pull out a little bit more of, if it was related to habitat. We also did a predator index as well that we're hoping to involve in that survival index. So trying to tease out what possible variables might be affecting that.
Yeah, because that's at least for me, that's surprising.
Yeah, exactly. I think most people would assume, that winter, maybe a harsher season, things like that. But summer, there's a little bit of a different, nesting and brooding, things like that. Maybe they're more vulnerable to predation at that point. They're not necessarily in their social groups like they are in the wintertime. So,
what do you mean by different scales of selection?
So for different scales, based on literature for resource selection, I think that came out in the 80s, people started to look at on what extent you actually view resource selection. So that means in terms of, I could look at something as specific as the exact spot on the ground, what that bird had in terms of the feed it was using, things like that. Or I could almost zoom all the way out and say, across this large area, what might be important in terms of that. So for us, we're looking at a slightly smaller scale. It's called third order selection. So we're looking generally at what that bird had available to it on a regular basis. So in terms of, the structure that influenced where that bird was, the composition of the plants, the diversity, things like that. So that's one portion of our resource selection. And then second order is looking at more so what the populations were doing. So that tends to be more looking at our study site as a whole. So we're not necessarily looking at structure, some of those finer things. We're looking at more of a macro habitat view in terms of what does the composition of vegetation types look like? What does the arrangement of those on the landscape look like? And how does some of those management prescriptions that we've talked about influence stuff on that larger scale as well? So, looking at their response to burns and disking and herbicide, things like that. So really trying to piece together a really entire wholesome view of what the birds are looking at in terms of resource selection.
Were there any kind of, I don't want to call them outside factors, but like if they were close to roadways or anything like that?
Yeah, so that's one thing. For our smaller scale stuff that we're actually looking at distance to nearest woody cover. Bobwhites are shrubland obligates, which means they need some form of shrubby, woody thicket cover for thermal cover from weather, also with predator escaping from predators. That's essential for bobwhites on their landscape. So that's one of the metrics. And then we also looked at, distance to roads or fire breaks to see whether that influenced bird use, maybe man-made, what is the right word, presence, increased activity, things like that influence birds, or maybe the structure was slightly different. The closer you got to a road, maybe the vegetation wasn't as dense or something like that. So we're looking at that, and then the survival analysis will actually be looking at things too, such as weather, predation. We'll bring in some of those other factors that affect survival. But resource selection analysis, we're really sticking to more the both vegetation structure and composition, and then the arrangement of things on the landscape and the management prescriptions.
And what are you doing right now?
So the field season is done, and I am focusing on doing the analysis portion of mine. So I spent the fall and a little bit of the winter trying to get a lot of different data formatted and ready to go into an analysis. So not only is it our telemetry where we actually located the birds, we also did vegetation sampling in both the summer and the winter seasons. So a lot of time doing that, and then right now trying to figure out, what is the best analysis for the questions that we're trying to answer. So a lot of continuous tweaking and trying to make sure things are up to date. So, but yeah, my first chapter will be essentially over resource selection, and sort of what you said, looking at it at two different scales or orders. And then the second chapter will be based over survival and seeing, if there was factors from that resource selection analysis that might be important to survival and seeing how that works.
Northern bobwhites, there's been a decline in Tennessee. I guess, what have you seen from your research?
So the decline is both in Tennessee and then nationally as well. All in all, bobwhites aren't doing great. But our research has shown, just even from 20 years ago, things like that, the decline's still continuing. So with what the agency has done, I think sometimes it's like any wildlife management in any regard, it's a little bit of trial and error. So way back in, I believe, the 50s or the 30s, things such as releasing pen-reared birds was super common. Turns out that doesn't work really well. then, different focuses on what management has done. But currently the agency is focusing on these quail focal areas to try to find the best management strategies possible for a robust population of bobwhite. So things such as reintroducing disturbance regimes, so such as fire and other disking, herbicide, things like that, to try to keep their habitat in that early successional stage. And then also focusing on removing a lot of the non-natives and just sort of opening up the areas as well. So hopefully transferring some forested areas into other open areas for bobwhites to be in.
Are you hoping, to publish that thesis and hoping that to forward it in any way?
We'll essentially publish the thesis, and that in and of itself is, I don't know if it's actually a true publication necessarily through a school. It's not published in a journal or anything. So, get the thesis out there first, and then our goal is to hopefully use some of those chapters from my thesis and then publish them in other journals. So hopefully each chapter will be its own manuscript that we'll submit. So it'll essentially be, finish the thesis, graduate, and then once I'm done, I'll still continue working on stuff while I'm at my next step.
Yeah.
So that'll be the goal. And then also, a lot of the things within my thesis is something that we'll also send off to the state agency as well. So they were really big funders of this project, so we're trying to make sure, they get as much information out of it as they can.
What are your next steps after you graduate?
So I actually just accepted a job, so that was very exciting. Yeah. So my goal new job will be a wildlife and rangeland biologist out in Idaho.
Nice.
Working with pheasants and quail forever out there. So
that's exciting.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. It's a really nice area. We always pictured moving west, so it works out really well for us. And going out there, my main thing I'll be working on is the sage grouse initiative out there, and working with a variety of different partnerships to implement that on the landscape. So I'm very excited.
And just because I'm not that familiar with it, what is the sage grouse? Grouse initiative. There we go.
No, you're fine. So it'll essentially be working to implement sage grouse habitat and conserve that on the landscape. So sage grouse themselves are facing a large variety of different conservation issues out there. So my goal will be working with things such as the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, areas of large public tracts, then also working with private landowners to try to have as large continuous areas of habitat conserved as possible. So part of that will be using some of the governmental programs, things like CRP, things in that regard. So yeah, I'm very excited about it. I still don't know enough about it, so we'll learn about it on the job too, but very excited.
You know more than I do. Do you feel like your research here will help you in that position?
I think so. I think one of the biggest takes from UT, and maybe it was the school itself or maybe my advisors as well, is really bridging that connection between wildlife research and management. Because I think a lot of times research might be done and you publish the results and that's great, but if you don't know how to actually, not enforce, but create a change on the landscape to help your research or show what that research actually did, I think that's something that sometimes is missed with wildlife research. So I'm really excited from what I've learned here in terms of more habitat management, things like that, to really take it out there and see how that works. So.
Is there anything that I haven't asked that you think people should know?
A lot of people, I remember, maybe older generations and stuff remember, when bobwhites were really abundant across the landscape, you could hear them singing and stuff all the time. And so I get a lot of questions on whether that'll ever be possible again. And it's not necessarily a pessimistic view, but based on landscape changes and, habitat fragmentation, things like that, bobwhites will never be on the landscape as they once were in the past. It's just not possible with what we're doing now. But I still think it's really vital to conserve them in the areas that we can and protect them and hopefully increase that acreage and, bring them back to public eye. I think a lot of people think of them as a historical species at this point, but they're not. They're still around. I think they're a really great species, and I think they do really well to conserve for bobwhite. Helps a lot of other species with early successional habitats as well.